Thank you. So, I'm from the ABC and my mic doesn't work. Nothing if not consistent. Gee, it's just like Saturday morning when something goes wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for such a good welcome. And Ben Shewry, it's a pleasure to actually chat to you about this book because I finished reading it on holidays, and I think you know there were times where I texted you from the Cook Islands to go, I can't believe you've actually said that. I've been wanting people to say that for ages. But the thing that strikes me about the book is you effectively left school at about the age of 10 to focus on cooking, and you worked in restaurants, but you still maintained your school career. And yet this is so well written from somebody that obviously has a love of literature. How did you manage to do that?
Simon, I've always had a love of writing. Writing has been, for somebody who grew up in entirely isolated areas in the backcountry, who is an introvert and wasn't around a lot of other people, I wasn't very socialised because I went to a school with 7 students and 2 of whom were my sisters and my mother was the school teacher. People are kind of terrifying. And so writing was the way to express myself when I couldn't talk, you know. And I think even to this day, I would still rather write than talk, you know. It's always been a love next to cooking that I've honed and cherished.
I love the writing, and you mentioned your mum, Kay. You mentioned also in the book the fact the older boys picked on you, and one of the boys tied a rope to a branch, another formed a noose, put that round my neck, while the third boy held me. This is a good insight into Ben's mum. They were just about to hang me when my mother, Kay, who was relief teaching that day, flew round the corner of the building. I've never forgotten the look on her face. Pure rage and complete focus. Like a big cat defending its young, she let out a reckoning shriek, so deep guttural that it wounded, that it reverberates with me still. As she sprinted at us, the fires of Armageddon at her feet, the older boys froze in fear. "You little fuckers!" she screamed. I don't think my mum ever called those bullies of mine little fuckers. I wish she did.
That's a story that I had for many years, passed off as playing in the schoolyard. I thought those boys were my friends. And I've actually recently, in the last few years, after talking about it with friends who have a better awareness of things than me, I've come to recognise what it was. It was a really extreme form of bullying, and it led to other memories like being put in a large barrel and rolled down a hill, which was equally as terrifying. But neither time I died, which is important to note. But my mother is one of my great heroes, and she straightened me out a lot in my life. You know, she's the sort of person that she grew up in, you know, I would say in a household, she'll hate me to say this, but in a household with racism, and like many families of that generation. And she was able to eradicate that in our family in one generation. And I think that is one of the greatest gifts that a person can undertake, to just see something and innately know that that's wrong, and then to just do something about it and stamp it out. And my mother's done that over and over and over again, and those bullies were certainly in her firing line that day. But there's been a lot of people in my mother's firing line, Simon, as you can imagine.
But also your dad, Rob, I think he showed you how to butcher. You learnt what would happen if you cut a cow's stomach in those delicate stages, but also how to forage so that when you and your sister could wander through the bush to a cub, admittedly you would eat things that didn't taste good, but you survived. Your dad taught you all of those things.
He did. My father, Rob, is the most gentle, most emotionally intelligent, kind man that I've ever met. He cries a lot. He cries almost, I feel like every time I see him he cries. And sometimes it's not because of something that I've done, it's just because he's connected to something. We listen to, you know, his favourite record on my stereo, which is a lovely stereo, Brothers in Arms. And he began to cry because the sound was so beautiful. And that's my dad, you know, he's a great role model to me. He was an artist. He sacrificed a lot of his own ambition for his family. And on the farm, it was a very raw and just normal rural experience. And the main thing about it was that we had no money, very little, but we had food because we farmed sheep and cattle, and there were wild animals in the bush, and there were fruits in the bush, and there were plants in the bush, and there were shellfish on the coast, and this was our larder and our pantry. And so we never felt poor because we had all this food, and my parents taught me how to harvest and cook it. And it wasn't anything extraordinary. They also had a big vegetable garden. And this is so informative to me as a person, this close to the source, this direct relationship with the food. And so even though we grew up with very little, we had so much, and all of our joy and entertainment was around the dinner table as a family.
One of the things I love about the book, and I'm going to divide it into 3 basic chapters, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly is what comes out of it from me. Before I get into, and we'll get to the ugly probably at the end, because I want to keep you guys on the edge of the seats, I want to celebrate the good as well. Because for me, you've gone out on a limb in this book, and you've said what many in hospitality are afraid to say. You've said what many in hospitality don't want to say. Were you worried that you would alienate and perhaps sabotage your career by putting all of that to here?
Yes, it certainly entered my mind on more than one occasion. Also my wife Kylie, who's here tonight, who's the general manager of Attica and features in the book many times in beautiful ways and also very traumatic ways. When I wrote Bats and Hats, which is the chapter about talking truth to power and the systems in which we live in and what we walk past every day and what we are happy to kind of put up with for fear, that's 10,000 words. We sat with this deep discomfort for, I would say, about 12 or 13 months while we actually kind of ruminated on whether or not I would allow this chapter to be published. And ultimately, the conclusion that we came to at the end of that was that if we cannot tell the truth, and I firmly believe that when you write, that truth is what writing deserves, and that is in fact the purpose of writing. And so I wanted to honour that truth in my writing. So I decided that we would find out, post the book coming out, whether or not we would be able to continue to run the restaurant. And if we found out that we wouldn't be able to after telling the truth, we would discover that it was no longer worth doing it.
Looking down at Kylie as then, thank you, round of applause. And if you want to find out the depth of that feeling, chapter The Pig outlines exactly the conversation they had, and a person called Surdo that really is, but that's more for the ugly when we get to that part. We're talking the good at the moment. Hopefully we'll stay on the good, because surviving COVID, which we saw in the Compass program, but also the whole idea of summer camp and B Corp, explain these positives that you've managed to engender both with your staff and the community around the restaurant.
Well, just to kind of recap on this COVID part, there's a narrative through the book called Man in the Hole Structure. So you meet the man, me, at the beginning when they're despairing, and he tries to get out of the hole and he fails, and he tries again and he fails, and then it looks like he'll get out and he doesn't, and then finally he does. And so this is the sort of tree which I'm hanging the leaves of the chapters on, if you like. And so the story of how our restaurant survived, and not only survived, but eventually flourished in the world's longest lockdown in Melbourne, 284 days, was something that was discussed that I might write with my editors, who were very, very keen for me to write the story. And I was much less keen. For me, it was so fresh, it was very recent, and I hadn't reconciled any of the things that we'd endured, and we all endured this. And so, if I'm being completely honest, those stories depressed me as I wrote them, and there was a period of 2 months that I was in a really bad place. And this happened a few times in the book. It happened when I wrote The Pig as well, which is a deeply personal and traumatic story. And so I would move on from those challenging writing, and I'd move on to something with humour. Hopefully you find it funny. I can't really claim that it's funny, but I tried my hardest. So I moved on to Chipgate, which is very tongue-in-cheek, and I felt better. But in every experience, I understood that as a writer, it was necessary to go through that, to relive it, to put myself in the shoes of the people whose stories I was sharing in an attempt to feel what they must have felt. And if you're writing with conviction and care, because the handling of other people's stories by writers is a really tricky business. And so it was kind of necessary, and I have a really great friend who helped on the book a lot, called Eric Jensen, who's an amazing Australian writer and editor of the Saturday paper in Melbourne. And he was a reader, and I had a moment of crisis. I actually had a panic attack after writing The Pig. I'll call it what it was. And the feeling in the morning had been very dark, and it came back in the afternoon. And I called Eric, and he said to me that a person has no place writing a book unless that book is capable of destroying them. And I thought, oh, fucking hell, where does that leave me? But I knew what he meant, and he had written a book about his friend Kate Jennings, the poet, who was his mentor, and he'd gone through a similar thing with it. And it is hugely compelling for one human to learn that their experience is not extraordinary, that other people, have endured and have suffered the same thing and been in the same experience, because the worst feeling as a human is to feel like you're alone. And I felt many times in my life that I was alone. Of course I wasn't. I was going through something that millions of people have been through. And so many times in the book, not only was I reminded by friends and mentors as I wrote that they've been there, but I tried to write it with that perspective so that somebody who was reading the book would feel less alone.
You do in Chipgate, though, manage in that humorous chapter where you obviously show your love of chips to then have a swipe at the Paddock to Plate farm restaurant that has its one little patch of lettuce that manages to serve a whole restaurant every day of the week. That gets under your nose, doesn't it?
It does, because we had a 2,000 square metre garden at Attica for 10 years, and we had a full-time gardener and multiple staff working in the garden, and we produced probably less than 5% of produce, probably not even 5%. So when I hear restaurants talking that they have a garden and they're producing 85% of the produce, they're just lying. It's just flat out like a lie. And you would need hundreds of acres, essentially, to be able to produce that level of food. And unfortunately, we sort of buy this from restaurants sometimes. And this chapter doesn't go into that, but where it does go is to the hypocrisy of our occasional hypocrisy, and also our greenwashing, which is something that I find at this time in history, greenwashing is so deeply offensive, and we should be outraged by it. And so sometimes when you go to a restaurant, it'll have a bit of a line on top of the menu, and it says, everything is coming from sustainable farms and small producers and yada yada yada, and then you'll order the chips, and the chips come from McCain. And this to me is just kind of hilarious and also a little bit sad. And the fact is that most of the chips that we eat in the world only come from 3 companies, all North American owned, and I'm just making an argument for chips being, the second greatest food in the world after lasagna. And I'm just trying to suggest to restaurants that really it would be so much greater if we could eat something that was actually made from a potato rather than a frankenfry. But I'll keep eating them regardless. I'm not that snobby, but I think sometimes the things that are right there in front of us, right before our eyes, that we walk past that we don't notice, are the most interesting to me.
Next time you're in Sydney, I'll take you down to Ben Sinfield. He used to work for Heston Blumen. No, not Heston, for just blanked on the name, but nose to tail, and
Fergus Henderson.
He worked for Fergus Henderson, thank you, and he does hand-cut chips in dripping in his restaurant, takeaway. You laughed when Ben said lasagna. How many people have read the book? So the rest of you are going to have to go back and buy it behind here to find out you're not, and he will be signing afterwards, you are not joking about lasagna. There are pages in the book, not just dedicated to lasagna, but the bolognese and the different ways of cooking. For example, you must have a wooden spoon to stir lasagna. You can't use something else. Would you say that you are obsessive about lasagna?
Deeply, because, you know, look, put it simple, I don't fuck around with lasagna, okay? Lasagna is fucking important. And lasagna, you know, is the story of my family's manufactured, invented culture, and this family growing up in the bush, this family that had this really big problem, which was there was too much beef mince in the freezer. My mother, being a great problem solver, went to the supermarket, bought this in the 1970s, bought this incredibly exotic food in a packet, and it was called lasagna. Nobody had ever heard of it. It's fucking wild. And she bought this packet of curly, sort of domino frilly pieces of pasta home, and she read the recipe on the back, which was rudimentary, because a New Zealander wrote it, and she made it, and that became our family dish, and we had it at every birthday and every Christmas day and every potluck dinner, and to this day, it's passed through 3 generations now. We didn't cook anything else from Italy at all. We'd never been to Italy, couldn't say an Italian word, probably couldn't even say lasagna right, but there we were, claiming lasagna as our own.
I'm about the 5th different recipe around lasagna in the book, and I could flick more and get more. There's something like 18 different steps on how to do it, including when you taste a bolognese, do not use a teaspoon. You need a full dessert spoon to really understand what's happening.
There's really important stuff for the future of food in that chapter. So, I mean, you know, all the big questions, not only about food actually, but in fact, life itself are answered. I invite the reader to join my bolognese cult. I lay out the 10 commandments of bolognese and lasagna. I throw Rick Stein under the bus, and in fact, the whole country of England. I make no apology.
I actually texted Sass Stein, Rick's wife, to say, have you read Ben Shewry's book? And she said, no, should I? And I left the conversation there.
I've never met Rick Stein. I'm sure he's amazing. He seems very lovely. He didn't really deserve it.
What's his crime? And you forgive him for it at the end.
I admit my own culpability in that I've committed more crimes, heinous crimes, lasagna and bolognese than potentially any other person on the planet. So, you know, I do kind of go there, but it's a study that I undertook for about 12 months. Went to Bologna, to the spiritual ancestral home of bolognese and lasagna. I go real deep. I made it pretty much every day. I bought all the equipment. Of course, it all come from the region of Emilia-Romagna, including the mincer and whatnot. I mean, you go there if you want, but I will say there's 3 steps, and you can't cheat them to get to bolognese heaven, okay? So don't try to cheat steps, please. Oh no.
Leading question here. Could they then do a vegetarian lasagna?
No. I think that's commandment 8? Can't remember. Yeah. Never ever.
I mentioned it was the good, the bad and the ugly. That was some of the good. The ugly really goes to the heart of the industry though, and there are chapters where we find that out. I want to get to one of them in a minute, but Bats and Hats and King Chef left me gobsmacked that somebody else in the hospitality industry would treat another person like that, and it obviously affected you the same way.
It did. It's a story in the ways in which power and fame corrupt people. And also it's a story about how we put our faith in the wrong people and how we often celebrate the wrong people. And I call these people false prophets. They don't deserve our adulation, they don't deserve our business support, they certainly don't deserve the young teams in which they're tasked to mentor, but they frequently fuck over. And for me, this is the experience as this young chef really looking up to this immensely successful and globally famous chef. And it's what happens when he invites me to his apartment. I'm not going to go into it too much, but we're kind of, the problem with this kind of toxic power is I think about this often, and we're kind of obsessed by toxic power, not only in our industry but globally, and because there's so much corrupt and toxic power in our world, and it's so in our faces, and we're fed it by media, and it's all that we can see, that we forget our own power, and we feel powerless as individuals, and that is a terrible thing for us to feel, because we all have the ability in small ways to change things, and I truly believe it, and I've seen it time and time again. So the reason why I share this story is to just show the ways in which we can forget ourselves, but also the ways in which people who become successful get swept up and carried away, and then they get addicted to fame, and they get addicted to awards, and they get addicted to adulation, and at the heart of it, they forget what truly matters. And this is not just chefs, this is artists or anybody, somebody in business, anyone on a journey. And I just want to make a really strong argument for taking care of the thing that gave you that privilege in the first place, and always refocusing and returning to that love. And that might be a good chance for me to read a little bit from the book. Oh, thank you.
Yes, and I think you should. There, you grab that.
So I'm going to read a little bit from that chapter, Bats and Hats, and
I might need a drink of the wonderful, is that the coconut rum? Ben, thank you. Go for it.
It's quite challenging to read it, but bear with me. My mother's hand hovers over a quince. Cloudy light glides through my father's stained glass window, rippling across the quince's yellow skins, which are placed in Mum's ripening spot on the sill. The fruit is from a tree above the porch, planted in the 1930s when our farmhouse was built. I'm mystified by this tree and its mercurial. Turns page. Produce. It smells how my grandmother's tin guava tastes, heady with vanilla and orange, the scent of places far from here. The promise of the quince is so great, but the give seems so little. I've tried it raw many times, and the flesh is tannic and sour, granular and coarse. I think of it as an angry fruit. Why is it not like the others in our garden? Fruits of instant gratification, like Granny Smith's and Winter Nellis pears. Even the brutally acidic Mellis crab apples are palatable to my 5-year-old tastes, once I've cleaned out the orchard of sweeter things. I'm a child who devours apple cores, whole feijoas, even the hairy skin of the kiwi fruit. But this fruit is hostile. The coal range stove warms the room as we sit at the wooden kitchen table and peel the quinces. Mum places them into her large wedding pot with sugar, water, cinnamon quills and a bay leaf. Oxidised, their flesh looks brown and ugly, like badly bruised spuds. For an eternity they simmer on the cast iron stove. Despite my frequent requests of, "Are they ready yet?" Mum won't let me disturb them. Mercifully, just before bed, they are done. We remove the lid and I look up at Mum and gasp, "Giant rubies!" The quinces have been transformed and shine a deep, dark red. To look into this pot is to see the soul of the fruit. I might be young, but this is all the evidence I need to confirm that cooking is truly magic. I am transfixed. The change in front of me is beyond anything imaginable. We spoon the quinces into bowls for my sisters Tess and Tammy, ourselves and Dad, who needs 2. Pouring cream runs through the crimson, pectin-rich syrup like a river meeting the sea. Silently, we inhale the fruits of our labours. Something shifts in me, the beginning of a great and captivating love. Cooking becomes an immense, heart-swelling feeling, teaching me that I can use everything inside me to make something special for other people. I see the glowing faces of my family, and I know that this is what I shall dedicate my life to, creating special joy from food. Mum recently told me, from your earliest moment, you're obsessed with pots and anything to do with the kitchen. I remember you boiling Dad's shoes in a pot with spuds on the kitchen floor. One of your first words was hot. You adored anything to do with cooking and food. At dinner, you would watch us eat intently from your high chair, following our every mouthful. Your cooking obsession as a little boy was almost like reincarnation, even though I don't believe in reincarnation. You recognised pots and pans like you had lived another life, and you always wanted to cook, even when you were too tiny to be able to. It reminded me of children who can speak other languages early. It was so strange for us to have this little child who was so intense about it. Over time, as cooking becomes my muse, it is as natural as breathing. It draws me in and consumes me. I search for the feeling of those quinces continuously within every new dish at Attica, for the ecstasy of creation that comes from being the first to imagine something, from making the seemingly impossible happen. This is the most brain-exploding feeling in the world for me. Besides my family, it is the thing that brings me more joy than anything else in my life. The intoxicating, maddening perfume of the quince is always there in each new challenge and each new discovery.
Beautifully done. Well done. It's amazing because in that very same chapter, you then go on to question, challenge, and hopefully shake the world of the restaurant reviewer. You say that when you won your first award, it was actually emptiness that came the day afterwards, and you began to ponder the qualifications of who should be a reviewer.
It was a strange feeling because, you know, I am an ambitious person, and being honest, coming into the kitchen at 27, being the father of a 6-month-old and having our backs against the wall a little bit, well, a lot, I wanted to win an award, and I write about this in detail. And then, you know, the next year or the year after that, I won my first major award, and I was so excited about it. And the feeling, it dissipated so quickly that I was stunned, because I thought that it was going to give this whole new meaning to my life. And I realised that the next day I had to return to work, and in fact everything was the same. And I suppose as time went on, and I mean I don't want to go into too much because it's all there in the book, but as time went on, my discontent grew. But this is a very, very powerful system that at the time you absolutely could not step outside if you wanted to survive. It's not possible in Melbourne in that time at all. The influence and the power that the large media organisations had over restaurants, and still do have over restaurants, could make or break a person, and it's seen people lose restaurants and also lose careers from bad reviews.
Here's one thing, dear reader, and I've known this for as long as I've been cooking. Restaurant reviewers really aren't any better at judging restaurants than you are. The majority of food critics don't have a better palate than you. They're no more expert than you. How could they be? They don't actually make anything, can't hack it in any other forms of journalism, because they never have to pay for their meals themselves. They are even less connected to restaurants than you or I are.
At that point of the fight, I realised that, you know, I'd better lay them out. You know what I mean? Like, it's, you don't go into that and say it halfway. You go in and you say it all the way, and you own it, and you just damn do it. And
I think there's somebody who works in hospitality here. It is, though, one of the problems, and you face it in the Compass. You, Neil Perry, and a few other chefs addressed not just the established reviewer, but also in these days the Instagram reviewer, who can be so nasty in so few words with so little training. And yet you managed to overcome it. There's a part in the book where you describe no negative attitude. That's a policy in your restaurant.
It is, yes, yep. I mean, there's been times, I mean, I should kind of the two separate things, what we're talking about really. No negative attitude is kind of a policy because of my failure of leadership, which essentially, the times that I failed in leadership, of which there were many, was really because I had disconnected. I fell into depression in the 2010s, and I kind of deserted the team, and that team kind of ate itself, and that was on me. When I came back from that, as I recovered from it, I made a new rule, and that rule was no negative attitude. And it's not toxic positivity, which I outline in the book in great detail, but it's just about bringing your best self to work and knowing in the ways in which toxic negativity is a real killer in a workplace, and it affects people in such profound ways that we just couldn't have it anymore. And I mean, I don't know if we're skipping back to the review system here
Yeah,
or not.
I want to, yep.
You want to?
Yep.
Where do you want to go? I mean, it's 10,000 words on it, so...
I know, but also you say that one of the, the question is why, if you've always felt this way, did you not just turn down the awards? Why did you choose to be a part of the system?
Because the system, when I entered it, it was all-powerful. And it had been long established before I came. I didn't have the courage to fight my convictions that I have now. And I also think that when you're 27, 28 years old and you're receiving benefits from something, even if you know it's wrong, it's really hard to say no. And so I guess through the years, my discontent grew, and I saw the ways in which people were chasing it and pursuing it and living as if that was the only thing that mattered, and it just seemed the wrong way to go about it. And that's why I wrote that story about the Quints, because I'm trying to get back right there to the core, the love. And you must understand too that when that these judgments are made by very small groups of people, 3 or 4, 5 or 6 often, they are often uninformed, they often are uneducated, and all I'm saying as a general rule in this chapter is that I've been cooking in restaurants since the age of 10. Now that is 37 years of continuous dedication and commitment and focus to my craft. If you want to judge the results of that 37 years as a critic, then you need to have brought the exact same level of commitment and ethics and knowledge for 37 years that I have. Because otherwise, your criticism is meaningless to me.
Go on.
One more thing on that, just to wind up. Do you want to wind this one up? Do we keep talking about
No, I'm happy for you to keep, yeah.
Whenever we put our faith in external sources, in the things in which we can't control, we will always set ourselves up for disappointment. And that's something that I've learned. That's something that my staff have learned. And the effects of the review system globally are completely and utterly devastating upon restaurants, on our mental health, and it has led to divorce and suicide and bankruptcy. And this is not hyperbole, this is fact. And in the time since I've written this book, the messages that I have received from chefs and waiters and restaurant owners are so deeply sad, and they feel completely alone in this feeling. And it's because for too long we've put ourselves in the global thrall of food media. And we've looked for external validation when we need to look inwards into our teams, into our communities for validation, because any kind of award system or fame or adulation is fleeting. It does not last, and nobody can be on the top forever. So you've got to return to the original thing, the joy of what you do. That's always what I believe.
Don't jump off the stage, but I was a Good Food Guide reviewer for 3...
Oh my God! Somebody acts...
Hi, I'm Simon. I was a Good Food Guide reviewer. It sounds like we're at a meeting here. And I couldn't, it wasn't, I didn't enjoy doing it.
Food Reviewers Anonymous.
Ex-Food Reviewers, I think it is.
Come to the wrong place for sympathy.
Well, the great thing is the one that taught me that I didn't want to do it anymore was our 12-year-old son, who just said, "Dad, can you not review restaurants anymore?" He hated it. And there was a childhood perception there that saw how fake it was. You weren't eating in the real world. Chances are that what you wrote that went in there was rewritten without checking whether it was. And then you saw hatted restaurants lose a hat from 3 hats to 2 hats. One because they had an outside toilet, bam, there's 15 grand a month. The second one because somebody said it's hotel food. And on 2 words, that restaurant lost a hat and 15 grand a month. You need the training that you go into, which is why, yes, we're doing the good, the bad and the ugly. When you come to the good, tell me about Jonathan Gold and why he's an example of what we should have as food reviewers go.
No, and I should clarify, and I make this abundantly clear in the book, that I'm not talking about all food reviewers. I've met many food reviewers, well, some food reviewers, not many is maybe sounds like there's hundreds, there's definitely not. I've met a handful of food reviewers who are genuinely good people and genuinely care about what they do and are educated and do understand the power dynamic, which is David and fucking Goliath. It is. It's small business and it's powerful media organisations who want to sell magazines, newspapers or tyres. That's a fact. It's the only way to look at it. So, what were we talking about before I started going off on that rant?
Jonathan Gold and a good reviewer.
Jonathan Gold was the food critic of the LA Times and the LA Weekly. And Jonathan Gold, for those of you who don't know, was really the greatest food critic who ever lived. He had won a Pulitzer Prize as the first person of any discipline of criticism to win a Pulitzer Prize for criticism. And Jonathan Gold was astounding because not only, so he had the dual worlds, and there's two worlds in which food critics need to coexist, and they need to be absolutely elite at both. But one is palate. So that's what chefs have in common with food critics. If you don't have an absolutely exceptional food palate as a food reviewer, then your judgments and your recommendations can't be trusted. Second, you've got to be a great writer because you're compelling people to go to places or to not. So he had an exceptional palate. He was innately curious, and he elevated the amazing food of the city of Los Angeles, and he really kind of he was known as the Valley of Los Angeles, but spending time with him was such a privilege because of his deep curiosity and the way that he always got to the heart of things so quickly. And of course he had come from a long background of being a part of punk bands and is a classically trained musician, the first person to write about NWA for Rolling Stone in 1983, I think it was. He was multidisciplinary. He didn't just know about food. He had an 8,000 record collection. He was just a really interesting person. But at his heart, he understood what was at play here, and he was kind of universally respected by the restaurant gang because he knew that at their heart, restaurant reviews were stories about humans. And those humans had hopes and dreams and lives and livelihoods and families, and there were consequences to those reviews. And so that's why we respected him. It's not that he wouldn't be honest, but he would more likely, if he didn't like something, not review it. If he didn't understand the culture, and we should say that food reviewing globally is an incredibly white occupation. In America, there's one black food reviewer at a major publication. One. That's astounding to me. It's very similar here. So he understood that he didn't have the cultural context of many of the foods that he was reviewing. So he would go back to the restaurants. He didn't have to pretend that he knew about them. He wasn't an expert on everything. And he would go back 7 or 8 times to kind of get a picture of it. And I think that's showing love and respect.
Yeah.
So at his heart, he was a huge fan and lover of restaurants. And I think that's where good criticism comes from.
I wholly commend the book to you. We haven't got time to talk about how you actually eat humble pie in describing dealing with Yola Tango, a band you really love. You made me cry when you described the experiences of Amy at the hands of a doctor that was dining at your restaurant, and she never works in hospitality again. There were so many elements. For example, I too was put into a tyre and rolled down a hill as a kid. But what I really was so relieved to find while I was reading this on holidays, I ran out into where my partner was lying and I said, guess what? There is somebody else. I can openly say that to somebody, I too am uncomfortable about Anthony Bourdain.
Yes. The chapter, The Pig, it's a very detailed story of something really terrifying and horrible that happened to Kylie, and she bravely shares that story. It's shared in her own words, and the way in which it comes around is at the height of Me Too in 2017 and 18, when we just started dating, and I'm really undergoing an education, and of course my strong belief is that it's, especially if you have privilege like I do, it's absolutely not okay just to complain and point the finger. We must start to analyse the symptoms and the reasons why things happen in our culture and our society, and why we allow them to happen, if we ever want to change anything. And so when I read stories about individuals, their wrongdoing, and this is the reason why I don't name anybody as well, because yes, there are bad people doing awful things, but there's multiples of these stories. And this is a bigger societal problem. It's not just about one individual, because the rest of us kind of get to wipe our hands and say, well, we don't have any culpability in that situation. And in this chapter, I'm also admitting to my own sexism. But I couldn't walk past Kitchen Confidential, which, and just to give a bit of context, I never really fit into the macho kitchen culture. It wasn't a friendly place for me. I thought the kitchen would be a home initially, and I was bullied in kitchens, and I had this deep love of food, so I made it through. When I read Kitchen Confidential, I was horrified by the celebration of the most toxic aspects of our industry and our culture. Over sexualization of women, blatant misogyny, the celebration of excessive use of alcohol and drugs. And that, as it turns out, has never felt like a very popular stance about Kitchen Confidential. And of course, sexism didn't begin or end with Anthony Bourdain, but that book has sold, I believe, over 1.5 million copies. And that book is held up by thousands and thousands and thousands of young male chefs and chefs of all genders in our world. And it's pretty hard to walk past the fact that that kind of glamorization of that toxicity and that behaviour says two things. The kitchen is not a place for women. And it really says, if this is the sort of man that you want to be in the kitchen, then go ahead and do that. It's okay, I'll give you permission, because this is the life that I've lived. And so when we're looking for the reasons why we are where we are, for me that's one of the reasons, you know? And people might disagree with me on it, but if you reread Kitchen Confidential now in 2024, or you listen to the audiobook, sections of it are really, really impossible to see as anything but incredibly problematic. Now, there's going to be an absolute fuck ton of hellfire coming my way for taking that stance. And I do also say that the book was not the man, and just as this book is not me, it's a part of me, or a snapshot of me at a moment in time. But none of our stories are finished. And so we all have to kind of believe that we can pick up the torch from where it was and move forward and hopefully into something better. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying, you know, that's not cool. That's not cool. And one of the greatest regrets of my life, or many of the greatest regrets of my life, are those times when I had the opportunity to say something or do something and I walked past. And I still live with that regret.
I think it's a great note to end on for me. Thank you. It's 10 years between this book and Uses for Obsession, so I look forward to doing this again in 10 years' time. I do commend, it's probably not available, but if you can find this in a library, it is one of the most beautiful salutes to a country and environment that we learnt to know through Jane Campion's piano, but goes much deeper. So Ben Shewry's Origin. Questions from the crowd? I've asked enough, and put your hand up and we will bring a microphone to you, or you'll just yell it at us. Oh, you're going to take Ben's microphone. That's good, because he's the one that's going to answer it. But I'll throw it across. No, because what I'll do is I'll repeat the question and then read it out. The table's not big enough. There we go.
Protect that. It's
a good book.
Value of a car.
G'day Ben, how are you?
Oh, hello.
For somebody that works in the industry, it's been amazing to read your book, but for somebody that's also going through a mental health journey, it's been incredibly inspiring just to pick up your book. I had no idea I was coming here tonight. Your book called to me off the shelf in Manavale about a week ago, but I guess what I wanted everybody to understand is, at what point did you feel like you found your voice, that you could speak out, that you could say that the industry's fucked up and it's not working and all of those things?
Not sure if you heard that, but after recounting personal observations that came close to the book, what point did Ben realise that he could tell the story of what was fucked up in the industry? And that's a technical publishing term.
That's a great question. COVID was a pretty big moment for us, and so some parts of having the courage to say the things that I've said came from the 2 years of respite that we had, really. So the feeling the effects of, the global restaurant reviewing machine. We had no reviews for 2 years. The first time in 27 years in my career that I'd ever had that, and it was just an amazing feeling to not have that pressure that a food critic could walk through our door and review us on any night. I think the writing that I'm really proud of, where I'm talking about Australian food and the food of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples, that was influenced, of course, by the many friends and people on country and elders that we get to work with and are mentored by, and also by the referendum. It was such a heartbreaking time, and there was kind of in response to that, and the talking about sexism and talking about racism in food and talking about mental health, it probably goes a way back. But I guess it's a bit weird to kind of go back into interview history a long way, but I've had to recently, and I realised that I've actually kind of been saying these things for more than a decade, but I never had the courage to put them all down on the page before and sort of really sit with them. And it comes back to really not wanting to waste any more time. I think I've just wasted too much time. I haven't been honest, I haven't told the truth. And it didn't feel good. And I've felt lighter than ever since it's come out, I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's a gradual process, Yeah. And thank you so much for your kind words.
To the centre of the room.
Yeah, thank you. Ben, thank you very much for your time tonight. So I have two questions, one light-hearted, one a bit more serious. So we have a daughter who lives in Adelaide, and question from her, I think she was one of the first people to buy your book, is why isn't Adelaide on the tour? Because she said she was the first one to buy tickets, so that's the very light-hearted question. Second question is really, we've been fortunate as a family to go to both Attica and then the summer camp, and really since COVID and your reflections on that and both those quite different experiences, how does that influence how you think about being approachable going forward?
So there's two questions. One, why aren't you going to Adelaide on the tour, particularly when it's got such good, fantastic food there? And the families dined at Attica and summer camp. And so how did that, I'm trying to work out what you're asking, but I think you know the answer.
Well, it's just impossibly difficult to get a booking at Attica.
Oh,
Yes.
it's not too hard actually. I think that's a little myth. Thank you first of all for supporting both the restaurants. That means a lot, and we always are so grateful to people that come. All the work that we do is on behalf of our guests, and we get to have a hell of a lot of fun doing it actually. And I want to say that in the book I express that fun. This has been a heavy chat. There's a lot of light stuff in the book too. The story of summer camp is one of my proudest stories because it's not my story. It's told through, an oral history told by Drew, who comes to us as formerly a sandwich shop worker, comes to summer camp, and it's this really ragtag crew of people working with us, and Kylie mentors her, and she's now the assistant restaurant manager at Attica some 3 or 4 years later. I think there's some moments in that 2 years of COVID which I never want to forget, and one of them was the determination to open this simpler, more casual place, albeit only for 5 months, because Attica was going broke and we had to do something. There's other moments like being in the bake shop and selling a $7 slice of cheesecake to a woman who had lost her job and had come to spend $7 of her last paycheck with us because, in her words, you're a community guy. And we hugged and cried. I mean, we definitely shouldn't have hugged during that time. It just felt right. I suppose it's like a hard thing, a restaurant like ours, it costs a lot of money to come to. Doesn't make a lot of money, but everybody's taken care of, and our staff and our suppliers, and so it's kind of equitable in that way. It is really hard to get. I mean, even the price. I'm not trying to justify the price, but the price should be more actually for Kylie and I to have a future. We were talking about would we ever be able to retire today? It's not likely. But I suppose what I'm trying to get to is the restaurant has always been about more than money, and it's about the experiences that you have with people, like the person in the bake shop, like the people that I will meet on Friday night when I'm in the dining room, and of course the experiences that we have with our team on a daily basis. To Adelaide, I'm sorry, Adelaide. It's not on the agenda yet. We just need the right opportunity, and I'm going to probably handball that one to my publishers.
Yeah, they put their hand up. I think you might be going to
Adelaide.
Oh, okay.
Next year.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I am going to the Adelaide Writers Festival. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. And I also should say my publisher, and it's been absolutely incredible. Just such an amazing, supportive publisher, and has taken quite a lot of risk on me. In the understanding that hopefully I can deliver something. Yeah.
It is amazing when people talk about the cost of a restaurant and it costs you $870 to take your car in for a service, but you don't a week later go, I had the best service of our car. Here's a little photo of the brake that they changed, and look, that's the lift going up to look under the tyres. Whereas a really good meal you do, and for somebody that, watches others pay $380 to see Katie Lang at the Opera House, you're thinking, that's actually a dinner at Attica. So I think the value needs to be revered. It's been fantastic to catch up with you. It really is a revelationary book. There are lots of funny moments. I just wanted to get really heavy because I work at the ABC and that's what we do. Would you please give Ben Shewry a round of applause?